What's up, guys? Welcome back to Falcon Central Radio, part of the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined by my co-host, Matt Karoly. We are back this week to talk a little bit about the big event in Atlanta later this weekend. We're going to be talking mostly about sort of our takeaways from some of the standout players at the Senior Bowl this past week. And of course, we will be answering your mailbag questions. It is a chilly Thursday evening here, Matt. I know you're up in Pennsylvania. Down in North Carolina, it's a chilly, like 40 something ish degrees. But
Yeah, that's not
in
chilly.
for us Southerners and probably a lot of good people watching the show in the state of Georgia, 40 degrees is very chilly. So I'm curious, sort of in your neck of the woods, sort of what the temperature is.
Yeah, we're in the single digits up here, so that's the true definition of chill. And
Yeah.
we got a good amount of snow, a couple inches on Tuesday. Got to stay home and work from home, which is cool. But yeah, it's frigid, man. Winter is here.
Yeah. So just wanted to get that out of the way. Let everybody's cards on the table about sort of what we are enduring to come at you on tonight's episode. You know, me in this 42 degrees is such a huge sacrifice. But that being said, one of the things to let you guys know at the top of the show before we get into sort of the meat of the show is that we're going to be changing things up a little bit in the off season, and we're going to try to have more shorter, condensed shows, probably stick to like 45 minutes or so pretty consistently, and try to get as much content as we possibly can within a 45-minute window. Sometimes maybe that'll be shorter if we have less things to talk about. And you know, what that's going to mean really is for you guys that send in your mailbag questions, basically at a certain point, if we have more mailbag questions that will push the show longer to the sort of hour and 10, hour and 30 minutes that sort of have been the usual in recent months. We won't answer those on the show, but what we will try to do is answer those on the Falcon Central Radio Facebook page. So if you guys haven't already liked that page and don't get the updates, you definitely want to do that. And so basically, what I wanted to tell you guys is for future weeks, when we are sticking to this 45-minute time limit, the earlier you send in your questions over at Falcons PFC, the Twitter handle, or on the Facebook page at Falcons Central Radio, you definitely want to use that hashtag Falcons Mailbag on Twitter, especially because the earlier you send in your questions for the mailbag, the more likely it is that we will sort of move them up the queue and prioritize them, because we know some of these weeks we won't be able to answer every question, and we want to get to some of the good questions at the top. So definitely send in your questions as early as possible. If that means, you know, the previous week, you want to send in questions for next week on you know, later tonight or whatever after we end the show, or whatever the case may be, go ahead and do that. And I just wanted to tell you guys that at the top of this episode. Matt, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, I mean, like you said, I think you covered it. We're going to try to give more content, maybe in smaller doses, but be more visible to you guys and kind of utilize all of our fronts as far as this show and then the Facebook page, and hopefully get the Twitter account even more active and kind of interacting with you guys there on the Falcons PFC Twitter account. So yeah, we're going to be coming at you all off season, and hopefully you guys tune in and follow along.
All right. So, as I mentioned at the top, there is a big event in the city of Atlanta this weekend, Super Bowl 53. We talked about it a little bit briefly on last week's episode when we sort of went over the Shrine game and previewed some of our players that we were key to watch in the Senior Bowl. But just wanted to circle back around just because it's topical. With this Super Bowl matchup between the Patriots and the Rams, not a whole lot to say. I sort of, last week, I wanted to say hopefully optimistic about the Rams' chances of winning, but as we get closer to the game, I feel more and more likely that the Patriots will probably find a way to take care of business. I just don't know if it's a great matchup for the Rams, but I certainly, as I mentioned, will be rooting for the Rams in this weekend's game. And Matt, do you have any additional thoughts on the Super Bowl?
No, I'm kind of with you. I think the safe money is on the Patriots to win this one and get their sixth under Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. For me, it comes down to the trenches. I think whoever can control that matchup, whether it be the Rams, kind of doing what they did to the Dallas Cowboys in that divisional round matchup. If they can do that to the Patriots, then I think they have a good shot to win this game. But, on the flip side, the Patriots, I think, are going to use that same strategy that they used against the Chiefs to try to keep, the Rams' high-powered offense off the field as much as possible. And I think the Patriots do have the blueprint to do that. I mean, Dante Scarnecchia, I don't think gets enough credit for the job that he does with that ball club and that offensive line. They've been phenomenal. The fact that they've only allowed 3 total quarterback hits against units that include Justin Houston, Dee Ford, Chris Jones, Melvin Ingram, and Joey Bosa. I mean, that's outstanding. So I think they can do similar things against Aaron Donald and Ndamukong Suh and be just fine. So to me, whoever can win that matchup, and I tend to lean towards the Patriots being able to do that since they just have a history of doing so. Then they're going to win. But I do think the Rams, they're good enough. They've shocked me already. I didn't think they were going to beat the Saints, so the fact that they did do that is a testament to them. But yeah, I mean, the safe money for me is on the Patriots, and kind of me shifting my prediction from last week where I thought that the Rams would win on a field goal. I think the Patriots probably now is my prediction if I had to give one.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Patriots are never a good enough team where you feel like they're an overwhelming favorite. Even last year, with the Eagles, it was fairly even matchup. Even if you thought the Patriots were going to win, you knew the Eagles had a pretty good chance. Obviously, the year before, I think most of us thought the Falcons would sort of take care of business in that game. So I'm hoping that, given, I know the Falcons didn't take care of business, but it looked like they were sort of putting it into the Patriots dynasty a little bit there. Obviously, they didn't finish. The Eagles sort of put a stamp there. And, if the Rams can sort of go 3 for 3 for NFC teams, just sort of, it actually finishes this game, unlike, some other teams. Maybe that will be sort of like the final nail in the coffin for this sort of Patriots era. And maybe we will see other AFC teams like Houston and Kansas City, among others, sort of, start to become the class of the AFC and get tired of basically Brady and Belichick taking care of business.
Yeah, I do think, final thoughts. I mean, if the Rams do win this one, I don't think the Patriots win another Super Bowl with Tom Brady or Bill Belichick, depending on how long he stays there. I don't know. Maybe he's in it for the long haul, but I think you're right. If the Rams can win this one, I think this could be the end of that dynasty.
Yeah. And, people have been predicting probably the end of that dynasty for at least a decade, and it hasn't ended.
It's true. That's true.
Famous last words is basically what the Patriots are dead. No, they're not. We do have a Super Bowl question from Brian at your homeboy Brian that is not related to this weekend's game, but he asked, do you think the Falcons have a better chance of making it back to the Super Bowl and hopefully winning it in 2019 or 2020?
For me, I think that comes down to them adding some impact talent this offseason on the defensive side of the ball. If they can do that, then I think yes, they have a shot of doing it in 2019 rather than it being put off. But I mean, that's a big if. We got to see who they cut. I know there's some reports out today where, Dimitroff was quoted in saying they don't know if they're going to make any big splashes or any big bold moves in free agency. So with that in mind, it makes me think that they're not going to cut some players that they need to cut to create the space to sign those impact level talent. And, therefore the impact talent is going to have to wait till the draft. And, you can't always rely on a rookie to make a major impact in year one. So, to answer the question, I think it all comes down to what they do in the offseason. If they can add some guys, some veterans, like a Brandon Graham or a Gerald McCoy, then I think they could contend. Because for me, 2019 boils down to the type of jump this defense can make. I think the offense is going to be fine. Maybe they're marginally better, maybe they're not. But even if they're not, I think it's still a championship contending offense. It just, it comes down to, does the defense pull its share of the weight and, do its job to help send them back to the Super Bowl?
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of summarizing sort of what they need to do to get back. I believe Brian's probably asked this question like 6 months ago in the summer. And I think at that time he asked, like, do you think the Falcons go back to the Super Bowl in 2018 or 2019? I think probably then I said 2019. And so now I will probably say 2020. It's just basically the year after next. But I think you're right in terms of, like, it does seem like because one of the questions I had late in the season was, given how the Falcons struggled in the second half of the year, I felt like there were going to be significant changes to the team. Now, at that time, I thought it was going to be more on the personnel side than the coaching staff, but I do think getting rid of a bunch of coaches does give the Falcons a little bit of an out to basically shaking up the roster too much, at least from a certain narrative of, buying into the whole notion of, this team is really talented and the problems were, on the coaching end as opposed to the talent level of the team. So they, at least in that, I'm not saying I agree with that. Please, no one accuse me of that. But I do think from, that sort of storyline perspective, they can at least sell that somewhat to some people, maybe less gullible people or more gullible people than me. But we'll have to see. It doesn't seem like, based off of what I'm expecting them to do this offseason, which is not necessarily to make wholesale changes, particularly in free agency, where typically you expect, as you mentioned, more immediate impact than you do in the draft, that I'm not really expecting the defense to make a massive jump. I think they'll obviously be much better than they were last year, but not to the degree where I'm truly expecting them to be like a contending top 10, top 12 type of defense like some of these other teams we see in the postseason this past year, coupled with the offense, which I think, given my expectations for this offense and not necessarily being this sort of record-setting offense like we see with teams like the Rams and Chiefs this past year, I do think the defense needs to be of that caliber to sort of, give them a real shot. But so all that to say is that's sort of why I'm hesitant to sort of buy in on their Super Bowl chances in 2019. But stranger things have happened. I certainly did not have any expectations that they would make a Super Bowl run in 2016 at this point, at that, what, 3 years ago. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think the main question is, what does he sell to Arthur Blank if they fall short again? Because, I mean, they made the coaching staff changes, and then do you think I don't think he's willing at that point, if you endure another, sub 500 season, to extend that leash to Dan Quinn, just because, again, what do you sell to him?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think it's going to be hard for Dan Quinn to survive a sub 500 season again, unless he can basically say, "Oh, what Matt Ryan missed 12 games or something
Right.
like that is completely crazy and catastrophic. That is obvious where you lose Matt Ryan and basically only Matt Ryan. I think even if you lost Julio for most of the season, I still don't even think that would pass muster because you still have Matt Ryan." And Calvin Ridley and Mohamed Sanu and all those other guys. So, yeah, I'm with you. So it's not to sit here and be like, Dan Quinn's on a scorching hot seat, but it is one of those things where to better improve his chances of being the Falcons head coach in 2020, I think the team has to make the playoffs. So we'll see. I think I think we both agree that they are more than capable of making the playoffs. The question is, can they make a Super Bowl run? I think.
Yeah.
So that being said, let's talk about another bowl game, a Senior Bowl, not the Super Bowl. And we'll sort of talk about some of our standouts. I'll be completely honest with you guys. I did not watch the game on Saturday. I will watch it at some point this offseason, but I was at a baby shower for a friend of mine and decided to eat and drink as opposed to watch college football prospects. But
yeah, you weren't alone there. I didn't watch the game either. I think it's an afterthought, honestly. I think more so the practice week means more to these players anyways.
I'll definitely check it out later in the offseason to sort of see how certain players, that once we get to March and April and we start to sort of focus in on a couple of guys, I'll definitely watch it to see sort of, my impression of performances in the game. But in terms of being glued to the TV, watching, 80 guys, it's like whatever, man.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about some of the guys that we were hyped about, at least going into the game that we did not watch from the practice week. And I'll give you the floor, Matt, to start us off.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the offensive line first. And, I'll preface by saying I think it's hard in these types of events for the offensive line to stand out because I think, these weeks are, set up for the skill guys to really make an impression on scouts. And I thought the offensive line was as advertised. They really stood out. I thought, for me, one of the coolest storylines was, Dalton Risner and Chris Lindstrom on that right side of the line, developing a chemistry that, again, people might blow it over as a fun story, but I think there's an underrated, trait to that two guys that I don't think knew each other heading into the week kind of developed, chemistry that's very necessary for offensive linemen to have, and kind of speaks to them and their intangibles that they can just come into a room and kind of, you know, get to know the guy next to them that they're going to be going to battle with. And those are the types of traits that I think coaches really look for. So for them to just kind of, take over a little bit and really exert their presence on the field was cool to watch. I thought other guys helped themselves out. I thought a lot of the tackles helped themselves. I thought Caleb McGarry had a good week. Titus Howard, who from a small school kind of, flexed his muscles a little bit and showed that he can compete with these guys. Andre Dillard had a good week. And then another guy, USC guy that really wasn't on my radar heading into the week, Chuma Adoga, which I'm going to have to go back and look at some more because from a measurable standpoint, he was kind of short to be a tackle, but I think he had enough length. I think he was over 34 inches, if I'm not mistaken. And he had a good week. So that's a guy that, again, depending on what the Falcons do at right tackle in the off season, whether they decide to bring Schrader back at a reduced rate or, bring some Brilo back. And if they're looking for more of kind of a developmental guy, or maybe not a guy that starts in 2019, but starts in 2020, Adoga could be, that type of player on day 2 or I don't know, day 3. I'm not sure exactly where he's projected, but I thought a lot of guys helped themselves out. There weren't a lot of, I would say, fallers from the offensive line. So yeah, those were my big offensive line takes. I thought the receivers too. There was a lot of guys there. The pass catchers really helped themselves out. Terry McLaurin from Ohio State, I think was a huge riser. We got to talk about Deebo Samuel, one of my favorite players in this class. I thought he probably helped himself out the most out of any player on that week. He was absolutely unguardable. And, for me, he was a guy I was saying if the Falcons do draft a receiver, it'd be nice if it was him. But I think he just entirely put himself in that at least round 2 range, early round 3 at the very latest. I think he's going to be a great player for a team. And then, Andy Isabella and Hunter Renfro, guys that might be available on day 3. Those guys just get open. They're prototypical slot guys, but I think, we talked about Isabella a little bit last week and how he does have that long speed that it's not just short area quickness. He does have track level speed, so he can stretch the field a little bit. So again, I was impressed with some of the pass catchers. And then even the tight end group, Foster Moreau is a guy from LSU. I think I've been talking about TJ Hawkinson kind of being this year's George Kittle, but the only problem with that comp is, Hawkinson, I think, is going to go at the very least round 2, whereas, Kittle really slid under the radar and went round 5. I think Foster Moreau is more of this year's George Kittle, where a guy, again, didn't get a chance to show his skill set really at LSU because of the offense they run, but I do think he has a complete skill set that some team's going to get a gift if he does fall to round 3, like I'm envisioning him to. So for me, that's the guy I got my eye on for the Falcons if they are going to go tight end. But yeah, now I'll let you kind of get in here and give me your takeaway since don't feel like talking or going on a soapbox too much longer.
No, I think you mentioned some of the guys I wanted to talk about. Like Chuma Adoga was a guy that wasn't really on my radar, and I typically love those sort of short offensive tackles that are don't have necessarily the length that NFL teams sort of require, that like 6'4.5", 6'5" type of size or taller to play offensive tackle in the league, and then you kick them inside and they become like studs there. And so he's a guy that I definitely want to check out. You're right. He had very long arms, almost 35 inches, I think the second longest of any offensive lineman behind B.J. Autry at the Senior Bowl. So he's definitely a guy I want to check out. Nate Davis was a guy that I heard. I saw a game of his going into the week and was sort of like, oh, this guy's intriguing as maybe a third, fourth round type of guy if the Falcons sort of want to get a mid-round guard that has some things about him. And from what I hear, had a pretty impressive week on the offensive side of the ball. Over to the defensive side of the ball, as you mentioned, it seemed like the offensive line was getting most of the buzz this week, unlike the Shrine game where it was mostly the defensive line sort of working over the offensive linemen. And so with that in mind, with the defensive line, there was a couple of guys that stood out to me, seeing some highlights on the one-on-ones in terms of practice during the week on the defensive line. But for the most part, I was a little disappointed to not hear as much buzz about guys like Zach Allen or Anthony Nelson. Some of these guys that I thought, had some intriguing skill. Jalen Ferguson, another guy that I think really had an opportunity to really sort of solidify their status as maybe some of those second-tier edge rushers, because we know there's a number of guys that are going to be taken probably high in the first round of the draft, and sort of if the Falcons don't pull the trigger on one of those guys, maybe they could get one of these second-tier guys. And I thought Allen and Nelson, and maybe in round 2, would be some potential options. And to sort of hear that they didn't necessarily impress all that much during the practices is a little disappointing. And I think we'll have to sort of see if they can sort of bounce back later on at the combine and really impress with their athleticism. Montez Sweat is a guy that really stood out to a lot of people. I think his wingspan, I saw somewhere that someone tweeted that his wingspan is like the longest ever recorded by websites like Mock Draftable, which have combine data going back to like 1999 and whatnot. So almost 20 years. So he's kind of a freak physical human being. From what I hear, his practice week was a little up and down, which is kind of what his tape is at Mississippi State a little bit. But, so I feel like one of the things that you hear often, particularly the week after the Senior Bowl, is people, I think, have a tendency to overreact a little bit to, the guys that stand out in the practice. I remember a couple of years ago, Braxton Miller was a guy that, tore it up at the Senior Bowl, and people started mocking him in the top 20 in the draft, and he wound up being like the 75th overall pick or something like that, and really hasn't amounted to much in his brief NFL career. So I think, hearing things like, oh yeah, Montez Sweat's going to be a top 10 pick, I'm not really necessarily buying that, but I do certainly think he has probably solidified himself as a first round pick that will probably go in the bottom half of the first round. And on top of the defensive line players, I was curious to sort of see, some of these pass catchers, as you mentioned. Penny Hart is a guy that is intriguing to me, and I'm going to have to go and dig up some tape of his, just because I do think the Falcons are going to probably target someone to sort of fill their return specialist duties this offseason. And Penny Hart reportedly just tore it up at the Senior Bowl this week. I think is pretty productive as a return specialist during his college career at Georgia State. Obviously has a local connection. I'm sure he'll be at the Falcons local pro day later this offseason. So I think he's a name that we're going to have to keep in mind, and, got off to a pretty good start at the Senior Bowl. And so he's a guy that I definitely want to check out a little bit more of, as this offseason progresses.
Yeah, you mentioned Zach Allen, and I did want to kind of talk about him too. While Deebo Samuel was probably the biggest riser, or the guy who helped himself out the most, I think Zach Allen was kind of the guy at the week that helped himself out the least. Didn't have a good game from what I heard, committed some foolish penalties, kind of, his lack of athleticism kind of showed quite a bit as far as that run in the arc. And I think the combine is going to be huge for him. Because again, I had athleticism issues coming into the week with him, and kind of they were confirmed. He was a great college player, very productive. I just don't think he's got the traits that translate, and we'll see if he can prove me wrong at the combine. But he's a guy that, you're talking second round. I'm talking third, fourth round at the earliest with him, and he's the type of guy that, again, I don't think he makes it in the NFL, because he doesn't seem to have a position either. I mean, he doesn't have the athleticism to be an edge rusher. and inside it, he hasn't shown that he can do that yet. So again, for me, he was kind of one of my followers from the D-line class. I'll also throw Shane Jimenez. I was kind of disappointed. I didn't hear a lot of him. He's one of my favorite guys, that I studied already from Old Dominion. Kind of a tweener, 240 pounds. Hopefully he can bounce back at the combine and kind of impress, because I do think he's going to test pretty well. But yeah, Zach Allen for me was kind of my biggest follower.
Yep, that's fair. Going into the week with Zach Allen, I sort of saw him more as sort of a third round guy. But you hear people talk about him being like a late first rounder, and so I was intrigued to see if he would live up to that hype. And it didn't seem like he did. So I agree with you. I think the combine is going to be critical for him, because I think he can contribute as a rotational player in the NFL. But as far as sort of being a piece that you're going to draft early, and typically if you're using a first, second, or third round pick on a guy, you want a starter. And if you don't have a position, it's going to be hard to start. So
yeah, I think like a 3-4 defensive end, honestly, might be his best fit at the next level. So, and that doesn't really, I mean, I guess you could say the strong side DN in the Falcon system could be a fit. But again, if you're going to draft someone high or to be an impactful player, he's got to have that pass rush juice that can really contribute all three downs. And I'm just not sure that's Zach Allen.
Fair enough. Yeah, I don't disagree with you. Any other thoughts on the Senior Bowl before we jump into the mailbag?
No, I think we covered a good amount of the big stuff.
Okay. Brian at Ice Julio Free, if the 2018 Atlanta Falcons would have avoided the injury bug, do you think they would have likely went deep in the playoffs?
Deep in the playoffs, I'm not so sure. I think, for me, just getting into the playoffs, I think would have been an accomplishment for them, given the team, given some of the deficiencies we ended up coming to terms with and realizing, midway towards the end of the season. But again, yeah, if they had those guys healthy, I mean, you could point to that Cincinnati game would have been a win. The New Orleans game would have been a win. So there's 2 wins right there. I mean, nine wins was good enough to make the 6th seed. So yeah, I think they could have got into the playoffs. Maybe they could have done the same thing that the Eagles did and beat the Bears. But making a deep run, not necessarily, no.
Yeah, I think the Falcons. I agree with you. I feel a little skeptical of that. Looking at it, they probably, if they, as you mentioned, if they had avoided the injury bug, probably would have added maybe 2, maybe 3 wins, and they could have potentially been a 5 or 6 seed, and maybe got it past the first round. But I think they probably would have got stopped in their tracks against the Rams or the Saints in the second round of the playoffs, and it is what it is. So
yeah.
All right, our next question comes from Archit Chala at class of 1704. What do you think of Ed Oliver? I am worried that he might be too similar to Vic Beasley. What similarities between the two could be a cause for concern, and what differences could help separate the two?
So I guess the connection here between Ed and Vic is that they're undersized players. Is that what we're to take from the question? Because I'm not sure.
I would imagine that I would probably make the connection that they're undersized for their position and that they are relatively unrefined, mostly great athletes than necessarily refined players at this point entering the league.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, if that's the case, then sure, I can understand why fans might have skepticism regarding Ed Oliver. I'm just willing to take my chance on those traits, because I think he's won in fashions that Vic Beasley hasn't demonstrated that he can win in. As far as, sure, Ed Oliver might need to work on some more counter moves, but I do think using his hands and all that stuff, I think that's something he's shown already that Vic didn't really show too often at Clemson. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I didn't really scout Vic Beasley in college, so maybe they did show similar traits, but for me, I see stuff of Ed Oliver as far as, I don't want to say generational, but I mean he's a firm top 3 player in this class. I'm not sure Vic Beasley was a firm top 3 player. I mean, I know he went eighth overall, but I don't think he was ever talked about as a top 3 player in his class.
I mean, some people liked Vic that much. I know someone who thought he was the best player in that draft class, but I didn't think he was. But
Yeah.
I didn't have a top 10 grade. I had a top 10 grade on him, but I don't think I had like a. I might not even had a top 10 grade on Vic. I know my grade on Vic wasn't as high as my grade on Jake Matthews, who I definitely had a top 10 grade on. Yeah, no, I think there's concern with Ed Oliver, like there always is with every prospect, because he's not as technically refined, I think, as say in comparison to Quinnen Williams. I think the size concerns, and we talked about this on last week or recent week's episode. I don't think are that big a deal, because I think he'll bulk up. I assume he will. Maybe I'm wrong. I guess we'll start to raise some red flags on the off chance that he shows up to the combine at 279 pounds and doesn't test extremely well and tests mediocre. And if that's the case, then we will have to sort of revisit a little bit of Ed Oliver. But until that happens, I'm pretty confident that he's going to test really well, and he's going to weigh in pretty fine. So I would say the biggest difference is I think Vic Beasley was just he was a good prospect, but I think the thing about Vic Beasley that you liked was his athleticism. I think that's probably the main thing you like about Ed Oliver, because I do think there are some issues with his technical refinement, particularly as a pass rusher. I just think he's sort of out athleting guys, and it's effective because he's such a great athlete, but it's not necessarily going to be something that will immediately translate to the next level without some more refinement. But I think with him, I feel a lot more confident that he's going to develop than I did with Vic Beasley, because to me, one of the issues that Vic Beasley had coming out of Clemson was he had real issues with length and lack of core strength. And that sort of, I think, limited his ceiling a little bit. So when people were sort of talking about him as a Von Miller, John Abraham type of prospect, I didn't really buy that. That's part of the reason why I didn't have that higher grade on him. I saw him more as like a Cliff Averill, Bruce Irvin type of guy. And I think Ed Oliver, the Aaron Donald stuff is probably pushing it a little bit too far, because Aaron Donald is such a rare and beautiful creature. But I think he's up there, man. He's like, you're right. He is kind of a generational D tackle prospect. And the last time we had two of these guys in the same draft class was Sue and Gerald McCoy. And while most people would probably say like Sue has had the better career, Gerald McCoy has been right there, right behind him as, one of the top D tackles in the league. And for a time, like 3-4 years ago, was arguably the best D tackle in the league. So, I think Ed Oliver has that type of potential, and I don't think Vic Beasley ever had that type of potential. So I think that's probably where I would just say the difference. They might be similar in certain ways, but I just think the ceiling for Ed Oliver is so much higher than it was for Vic Beasley when he was coming out of school.
I think also a point needs to be made that Ed Oliver was a top high school recruit, and he transitioned that and kept with that at college, and not all top high school recruits do that. I mean, there's a guy at the Senior Bowl, Byron Cowart, was one of the top high school recruits in his class, and he ended up transferring from Auburn to Maryland, and kind of he's now looked at as just maybe day 2, if not day 3 player. Whereas Ed Oliver, I mean, he's consistently dominated every level he's gone to. So I think that is in his favor, as well as where it wasn't necessarily in Vic's favor. Vic was a guy that I think came to Clemson as a tight end and tried running back, or maybe it was the opposite, and then eventually went to DN. So, for a guy to dominate every level that he's been at, I think that's another testament to him and what he can bring then at the next level to tap into, again, an even higher ceiling, like you mentioned.
Speaking of Vic, Rise Up, Ryan KC asks, what are the chances Vic Beasley is back with the Falcons next year? And if he isn't, which players in the draft or free agency would you guys personally want at edge rusher?
I mean, it might seem like a cop out answer, but I think it's 50-50 at this point. We've gotten, reports, maybe a month or so ago from like Jeff Schultz saying that he talked to a scout in the building that doesn't think it's going to happen and they're going to move on from him. But then you hear reports more recently saying, yeah, they like Vic and, they want to try to keep him and they're going to see, how they can negotiate a contract with him. So honestly, for me, I won't be surprised with either outcome if they try to keep him now. Again, if they keep him, they better do the smart thing and negotiate, a salary that fits what he's bringing to the field. Because if not, then again, back to our earlier point as far as where this team, what heights this team can reach in 2019, it's going to be tough for them to do that when you're cap strapped with a contract of Vic Beasley on the books, and you're not really getting the ROI that you could be getting from that. So again, I can go either way. If they do move on from him, and I'm hoping that that's kind of what they do, I think it's best for both parties. Then that's when I'm looking at adding a veteran defensive end to that spot. Brandon Graham's at the top of that list. I'm expecting Olivier Vernon to be cut loose from the New York Giants because of a cap casualty. He immediately jumps right up there with Brandon Graham for me. But if not them, I'd be satisfied with a Preston Smith from the Washington Redskins or a Zadarius Smith. I think those are good options to pair with Takk McKinley opposite him. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at if Vic is gone and they need to look to replace that spot and add a starter. Because again, I think the free agent market is better to add defensive line talent this year than necessarily it is in the draft. I mean, in the draft, it's great for the D line, but I think again the offensive line, if they're going to upgrade both, which they need to do, it's better for them to get an offensive lineman in round one because I don't think you're going to find starting caliber offensive linemen past round two in this class. Whereas, this D line class is deep. I mean, guys like Reynolds Wren, Daniel Wise, Joe Jackson. I mean, there's guys on day, 2 and day 3 that you can potentially get that could be starters down the road. Whereas again, I don't think you can get that in offensive line. So for me, they move on from Vic. They got to find that replacement in free agency.
Yeah, as you know, the answer to the second part of the question, to add another name to the list of potential free agents that I would target, I put Shaq Barrett on that list. But from what I'm hearing, and I don't have like deep inside sources. Let's just say I heard from a person who heard from a person who heard from a person who's dating a person who heard from a person who is a high-ranking Atlanta Falcons official. So I don't know anything, but from what I'm hearing, they're keeping Vic. So I would say there's like an 80% chance he's back. And at least for me, the reason why I think it's that high is because it kind of confirms what I've had a feeling of all along. Like they're just going to keep Vic because I don't think they sort of see their lack of pass rush as dire a situation as probably many of us fans think it is. I think they also sort of believe that Vic Beasley isn't that far away from, a rebound season. And truth be told, like it wouldn't totally shock me if Vic Beasley has double-digit sacks next year. He just basically has to he had 8 hits this year, and basically just turn all those hits into sacks and get a couple more, and all of a sudden you're at 10 sacks, even though technically he's not really improving all that much. He's just getting a couple more sacks because one of the things that's been pretty consistent with Vic the last couple of years is he gets a lot of cleanup sacks. He gets some sacks off of scheme and twists and stunts and whatnot, and like 3 of his sacks this year were cleanup sacks, and I think he had another hit that was a cleanup, and he had a hit that was a twist. So like that's pretty consistent with him. And so if you can get those 5 or so, or turn that into 6, and then basically get a couple of times where he actually, hits that speed and going up against, you look at the Falcons 2019 schedule, they got teams like Minnesota and Arizona and Tampa Bay and Jacksonville and Houston, all these teams that have major issues at their right tackle currently. And it's possible that all 5 of those teams could be starting, rookie right tackles, and there will be opportunities for Vic Beasley to feast on that. So from that perspective, like if someone said like, oh yeah, Vic Beasley had, claimed to be a time traveler from the future, and they're like, yeah, Vic Beasley had, 10, 11 sacks in 2019, and I could buy that. I don't necessarily know if that means he's back and he's, worth the money and the capital that the Falcons have invested in him. But, I think it's a small jump from him, from where he is right now to being a double-digit sack guy, which I think sort of speaks to sort of the notion of sacks can sometimes be a little overrated. And I think that's been especially true with Vic Beasley's career. But yeah, I think he's going to come back. I think the Falcons are going to keep him, and they're going to basically say, we like Tack, we like Vic, we like Grady Jarrett, and we just need to add one more piece to the puzzle. And maybe that's a free agent, but right now I'm sort of expecting it to be their first-round pick. And that's going to be what
he comes back at the $12 million salary?
I don't see why he wouldn't, because I don't see him. I mean, unless they're going to give him, a $40 or $50 million
well, that's the thing.
contract.
Do you think they're gonna commit to him long term? Do you think it's that strong of an affection towards him?
I think that's the craziest thing I've ever heard, but because the Falcons are the Falcons, like I can't put anything past them. Because it sounds like that's something that they're talking about. To me, it's crazy to me to even talk about it. Like, it's crazy to me to bring him back at $13 million.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And it's crazy to me to even then to not only bring him back at $13 million, but be like, let's get him a long-term contract. So my expectation is they'll bring him back at $13 million. If he has his rebound season, he has it, and they'll pay him next year. If he doesn't, then they'll let him walk, and they'll get a compensatory.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to bring that up. That is the one positive about it is, they can't get a comp pick if they choose to not keep this 5th year option, but they can get one if they let him play it out and then decide, all right, he's not worth the long-term commitment, and then they can get maybe a potentially 3rd-round pick if some team's foolish enough to maybe commit top dollar to him.
You have it. So that's it, guys. We will get to any lingering questions that you guys sent in or will send in, probably potentially this weekend, right, Matt? I don't know what day.
Sometime this week, maybe before the Super Bowl, a little prelude to it.
Yeah. So definitely check that out. Again, check out Falcons Central Radio. So even if you didn't submit a question before tonight's episode, you still have time to do so, to send it in, and make sure that you send it on Twitter using the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. You can send it to Matt, who's at Matt Karoly, Karoly on Twitter. I am at FalcFans, FalcFans, or you can send it to the show's Twitter handle, which is Falcons PFC. Of course, check us out at ProFootballCentral.com. Make sure you subscribe to the Pro Football Central YouTube page. Make sure you hit that bell icon so that you know when we go live each and every week. We probably won't be back next week unless something major happens. Probably we'll punt till sometime closer to the end of February to get you guys geared up for the Combine. But if there's any breaking news or anything like that, then you can also check us, our reactions to that, which we will also be posting on the Falcon Central Facebook page as well. So definitely stay geared to that. And anything you want to add, Matt, before we duck out?
No, I think you covered it, man.
There you have it, guys. We'll be back later in February at some point. So we'll see you then.
Catch you later.